My wife and I recently had the opportunity to go up to Tennessee and Virginia, and we were visiting family, and we were able to head into the mountains for a few days to hike on the Appalachian Trail. And it's a wonderful opportunity. We're part of a group that does that every year. We go up and hike, we pick berries, we relax, and just enjoy the mountains that I originally grew up in. We began the trip early in the morning one day back in August of this past summer. And for an hour, hour and a half, we take these windy mountain roads, and remind me of some of the roads around here, very narrow, very tight, until we get to the base of the mountain. And then we get on those dirt trails that can roughly be called a road that take you up higher into the mountain to the base camp. You feel like you've been through an earthquake by the time you get up there. But once we get to the base camp, we get out of the vehicles, we strap on our backpacks, and we begin the trip up the mountain. Well, as we were heading up the mountain this year, I began to feel the very heavy pack digging into me. My wife and I are both carrying these big giant backpacks, and I had weighed this thing at home, 70, 75 pounds, which is about half of what I wish my weight was. But at home, I did walk up and down the hallway a couple times, and it felt fine, so I thought I was golden. But then heading up that mountain, I began to feel a little differently about things. And I'm going to blame it on the altitude, but the truth is I probably wasn't in the shape that I should have been in. But we made it just fine. We had a little soreness, but it really made me think about the baggage that we carry around with us. We make camp up there in the wilderness, and there are no facilities, and I mean no facilities at all. So you have to take everything you need for those days that you're up there in the mountains. I like to be prepared for about anything, but I began to wonder what it is I had with me that I really didn't need. What was the baggage that I could have cast off? Well, through the course of those days in the mountains, we had no cell phones, of course. We had no emails, no messages, no phone calls, no TV, radio. So we had no distractions. It's very peaceful. Of course, we do have to watch and see what's going on in the world. But what a nice thing it is to become separated from that every now and again. And that's some of that baggage that we carry around with us, and it was so nice to escape that a little bit. Well, brethren, we're here at the feast, and the feast is a wonderful time for us to evaluate the baggage that we carry around with us, see what it is that we need to keep in our packs, what it is we need in our baggage, or what it is that we need to cast off as well. It can help us be more effective as Christians in this upcoming year. We have some time between now and the spring holy days. We can evaluate what it is we need right now. There's a scripture that goes hand in hand with what I was feeling up there in the mountains. I couldn't remember all of it at the time, but it's Hebrews 12:1. Let's turn over to Hebrews 12 and verse 1. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Now, obviously, up in the mountains, I couldn't do much research, but I was thinking about the part of laying aside the weights. But when I got home, I did a little more research, and there's a lot more to this little verse. I primarily use Barnes Notes. I like the way they describe this verse. And the verse starts with "therefore." So it's referring back to something. In this case, it's referring back to Hebrews 11, and it's in view of the faith chapter there, the heroes of the faith. And Barnes doesn't necessarily feel this way, but lots of biblical scholars feel that those first 3 verses of chapter 12 might also be included with chapter 11 as well. But it goes on, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, being surrounded or encompassed by a cloud of witnesses refers back to that faith chapter, those heroes of the faith that we have read about so much. And it also, as Paul often does, there's an allusion to the ancient games as well. And they had those colosseums where there was a crowd around them. So we're thinking of that type of situation where we're being cheered on. Now, it's not saying that those heroes of the faith were actually alive at that point, but it actually means that we ought to act as if they were in sight and cheering us on. They knew that the people listening to this letter from Paul at the beginning knew that those people were dead and gone, as we do. But we should see their example. We should try to follow that example and be cheered by that. The next part of the verse says, "Let us lay aside every weight." Now, the Greek word for weight is ogkon, O-G-K-O-N. And it means what is hooked, or a burden, or encumbrance. And once again, there is an allusion to the runners of the ancient games. A weight is not necessarily something that is a sin, but think about it like you were running a race. Anything that's too heavy for you, it's not necessarily carrying a big stone, but if your shoes are too heavy, you don't want to wear boots or blue jeans while you're running a race. You want to be well equipped for running a race. It will hold you back if you're not wearing the right things. Some of the baggage that we carry around with us may not be sins, but it may be something that holds us back from being a better Christian. Things like a negative attitude that some of us can get into every now and then. Depression, a temper that gets out of control every now and then. It can encumber our ability to move forward, and it can weigh us down. We've all felt that weight from time to time. Just as I was feeling those straps from my backpack digging into our shoulders, we can feel those weights of things that hold us back. Now, the verse continues from Hebrews 12:1. It says, "And the sin which so easily ensnares us." Now, this is not referring to a specific sin. No, it is referring to a specific sin. I'm sorry. It's not referring to sin in a general sense of a word. It's referring to a sin that may be our primary area of weakness. I'm sure all of us have something that we could label as that sin that holds us back, that keeps us from moving forward. And remember that this verse does refer back to those heroes of faith, but were any of those people listed in Hebrews 11, were any of them perfect? We don't need to be intimidated by that, thinking, oh, they're perfect. You know, they had no sins. They had those sins as well. But the one thing they had in common is they had that faith in the one man who went without sin, the one man who was perfect in Jesus Christ. Now, the verse ends with, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." Now, endurance, we think of perseverance here, and so we should continue to run this race without allowing ourselves to be hindered by obstructions, to be hindered by the weights that can hold us back, being encouraged by the examples of those in the faith chapter, being encouraged by those who came before us. I'm sure each of us know people who came before us, who died in the faith. We can look to their example and learn from that. So what do we do about that baggage, brethren? I want to give you 3 simple points that will help us cut the weight that we don't need, things that we may be carrying around with us. Now, most of us have taken a vacation, or at least you've come to the feast like this, and you have to pack, you have to plan out what it is you need, especially if you're flying like most of us did here. You have that 50-pound weight limit. Did you all make it inside of that 50-pound weight limit? I know when we were packing, we were being quite cognizant of that. The kids and I were packing, and we would pack a little, and then we would weigh, and we'd pack a little and weigh. We thought we were being smart about it. My wife, she was in the room packing, and she decided she would just pack everything and then weigh. And so I walked in, and she was done at a certain point, and she goes, "I'm so proud of myself. I'm taking so little. I think I'm well below the weight. I'm far below what you guys are taking." And so when she was done, she said, "Okay, well, you go in and weigh mine." So I grabbed her suitcase, which was up on the bed, and I pulled it off. And your first clue is it cracked the slab when it hit the floor. So we'll get that repaired when we go home. But we went out and weighed it, and sure enough, 140, no, she was at about 55 pounds. So she had to remove some of the baggage that she had in her bag in order to meet the weight there. So first and foremost, our first point is to prioritize. You don't need to turn there, but Proverbs 4, verse 19 says, "The way of the wicked is like darkness. They don't know what makes them stumble." We have to be aware of what the conditions are. That we don't need at that point. And prioritizing our time is a great place to start. We might think, man, I really got to catch that next episode of Mad Men or Downton Abbey or whatever the addictive show is that you need. But does that come at the cost of Bible study or prayer or things that we really do need? Realize that the baggage or weights that hinder us also are different for each person. What is bad for some may be good for others. And it's referring to things that aren't sins, of course. I don't want you to think it's referring to those type of things. But say packing a parachute in my backpack as I go hiking seems kind of stupid, doesn't it? It'd be a lot of extra weight, something I don't need. But if I was going skydiving, it would get a little higher on the priority list. You would need that at the time. Well, if we have things in our lives like a competitive spirit, if you're an athlete, a basketball player, you need that competitive spirit. But if you're somebody who sits around and likes to argue all the time, it might not be so helpful. Now, the second point is to evaluate. We first prioritize and then we evaluate. That may seem similar in certain ways, but we can't just sit back and hope that everything that we've done, every decision we've made in prioritizing has worked out great. We have to learn to evaluate and see how that's working out. We have to be able to make changes because life changes, doesn't it? Every day life changes a little bit, the situation we're in changes, and we have to be able to make those changes. We have to be able to learn from our mistakes. I brought a couple of gallons of water on that hike, which is pretty heavy in a backpack. Now, if I had a little half a pound water purifier, which I saw people have up there, I could have done without that weight. We had tons of rain. I could have purified some water. That would have saved me a ton of weight. I also brought a bottle of bourbon. Those of you who know me would have guessed that. But I thought it would be nice to have a little glass of bourbon every evening. But by the end of our time, I gave away the rest of that bottle of bourbon to a much younger, stronger guy to carry down for him. So he got the reward of having the bourbon, but he had to carry the weight. And maybe you shouldn't give away your sins. That might be a bad thing. I should have thought of that failed analogy right there. But remember that all of us will make mistakes. Not everyone takes the opportunity to learn from those mistakes, though. Now, in evaluating what we're doing, we should also learn from the success and failures of others, not just our own mistakes. See what other people are doing and see that we can learn from that. My friend Beatty, who went with me, he's done that trip up into the mountains for 30 different years now, 30 years in a row. His pack is full, but he has organization skills. He has all the latest technology. He's a very efficient hiker. Now, we also had another friend who came up who had a very heavy pack. I mean, this thing was over 100 pounds. Now, in that pack, he had a beautiful tent. I mean, this was a palace of a tent if you're going hiking. But that's about all he had, and his wife carried up a few pieces of candy and a bottle of wine. So the first night, they set up their tent, and it was a beautiful thing. I mean, everybody wanted to get in there. It was raining a little bit. People sat in the tent. They enjoyed their wine. But you know what? The next day, they had to go home. We have to make sure that our baggage includes what it is we need, not just one nice thing. Now, it's also not a bad idea to write down your evaluation. In our spiritual lives, we have things that we learn from. We learn from others. Make some notes on that. I came back from camp this year, Camp Carter down in Texas, and I had a lot of notes that I wanted to keep track of for next year, what it is I needed at camp. And the kids thought it was a little OCD, but I wanted to make notes because obviously I'm getting old and my memory is going a little bit, so I wanted to know what it was I needed the next year. We need to write those things down in our spiritual life as well. It can act as a very valuable tool that we can use in our life. Now, our third point after prioritizing and evaluating is to adapt. We can set our priorities. We can do our evaluation, but if we don't adapt, if we don't make changes, then the first two are of no use. It stands to reason that if we frail and flawed human beings that have all sinned must be in a constant state of change. We have to be working to make ourselves more like Christ, who is the one who is perfect, who is our example. I suspect that if we don't make those changes on our own, that God will make those changes for us. Most of us being Americans, we see that our once great nation is starting to change. And maybe some of the wealth that we have enjoyed throughout our existence is maybe part of what is causing us to fail and taking us further and further away from God's way of life. But we see that falling. And I think as God is pulling back some of His blessing now. And we see throughout the course of history that God pulled back His blessings from the nation of Israel several times. But we individually should recognize God's blessings. And we should continue to look for ways to improve ourselves. for ways to run a better race, to be a better hiker, whatever analogy you want here. But we also have to realize that we can't do this on our own. We can have the best intentions, we can prioritize, we can evaluate, we can adapt, but we can't do this all on our own. We need God's help, and it's an amazing thing that we can go directly to Him and ask Him, help me through this. Help me through this problem. Help me alleviate what I don't need. Give me what I do need. He will help us through that. He says we can do all things through Christ, so we can go through Him, and it's a wonderful blessing that we do have. Let's look back at Hebrews 12 there, if you're still there. We read verse 1. God not only wants us to run this race or take the hike, or whatever metaphor we're using here, to live a godly life. He wants us to finish, to persevere. And He gave us His Son so that we can do that, so we can see an example. We finished in verse 1, and the end of that was, let us run with endurance the race that's set before us. Well, verse 2 says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider Him who endured such hostility from sinners against Himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Brethren, when the end of the race has the prize of being in God's kingdom that we're celebrating here, we don't need to be weary. We don't need to be discouraged. We don't need to let those weights or unwanted baggage hold us back in this race that's set before us. So let's continue to unload the baggage that we don't need and add the baggage that we do need in this race to the end, to the kingdom of God.